In the glittering expanse of the Viralis Nebula, where stars burned in cascading hues of violet and gold, the battle for Zon reached its crescendo. Princess Althara stood at the heart of her command ship, the Luminary Veil, her violet eyes fixed on the massive holographic display that mapped the chaos of war below. The crystalline crown on her brow refracted the dim light, casting fleeting rainbows onto the walls of the bridge, a stark contrast to the grim determination etched into her face. Around her, officers buzzed with the controlled frenzy of a crew holding the line between survival and annihilation. Reports filtered in, troop movements, energy surges, and the ever-present casualty counts. Yet amid the clamour, Althara was the unshakable axis. Her voice, calm yet firm, directed the tides of battle like a celestial conductor orchestrating the symphony of destruction. The enemy, the Dexion, were relentless. Towering beings of obsidian armour and bioluminescent veins, they had descended on Zon without warning, like a pestilence out of legend. Their technology was both beautiful and horrifying, ships shaped like predatory sea creatures, their engines leaving trails of phosphorescent light as they tore through the Zon fleet. Enemy war cruiser advancing on Sector 12, barked Commander Vak, a wiry man whose nervous energy Althara had learned to tolerate. We'll lose the orbital defences if they break through. Redirect the shard flame carriers to intercept, Althara ordered, her voice cutting through the noise. Focus fire on their lateral engines. If we can't outgun them, we'll outmaneuver them. Her orders were met with a flurry of affirmations, and the tactical hologram shifted as her commands took form. But even as she watched the tide turn in her favour, her thoughts lingered on the coalition forces stationed on the planet below. If they failed to hold the ground assault, no victory in space would matter. Leading the charge on the surface was the newly promoted Commander Kale Evan. Kale. The name had struck her like a thunderclap when it first appeared on the roster. It was a common name among humans, she had told herself. It couldn't be him, not after all these years. Yet the faint, nagging possibility had stayed with her, gnawing at the edges of her focus. She had resisted the urge to review his file, unwilling to confront the hope or fear that lay hidden in her memories. On the surface, chaos reigned. The skies were a fractured mosaic of smoke and fire, the sun's light struggling to pierce through the haze. Commander Kale Evan crouched behind the twisted remains of a Dexion assault pod, his pulse rifle humming faintly in his hands. Around him, his unit regrouped, their banter a thin veneer over the raw tension of the battlefield. "Evan," called Sergeant Vaughan, a burly man whose armour seemed barely capable of containing his bulk. "You planning to take out that walker with your charming smile, or should we actually do something about it?" Kale smirked, the corner of his mouth quirking upward in a way that made him look more amused than worried. "You're right, Vor. My smile's lethal, but it's not that lethal." He tapped the side of his helmet, bringing up the tactical display. "All right, let's see if we can't give our friends in the sky a little show." The walker in question was a massive Daxian war machine, its legs like the trunks of ancient trees, its sleek, segmented body bristling with weaponry. It moved with a terrifying grace, each step shaking the ground and sending clouds of dust and debris into the air. Kale knew their odds weren't great, but he had made a career out of winning fights he shouldn't have. "Vaughan, take the heavy gunner and flank left. Sarah, see if you can get a clear shot at the thing's power core from that ridge. Everyone else, keep its attention on me." "Classic Everin plan," muttered Sarah as she checked her rifle's charge. "Make a spectacle and hope we don't all die in the process." Kale grinned. "Exactly. Now move." As his team scattered, Kale bolted from cover, his boots kicking up dirt as he zigzagged across the battlefield. The walker's targeting systems locked onto him almost instantly, its plasma cannons firing in precise bursts. He dodged with practiced ease, the air around him crackling with energy. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice amplified through his helmet speakers. "I'm right here, you oversized glow stick." The walker turned its massive head, swiveling to track him. Kale fired a few shots at its sensor array, not enough to do any real damage, but enough to make it angry. Meanwhile, Vor and Sarah moved into position, their movements obscured by the dust and smoke Kale's antics stirred up. "Evan, you've got about 10 seconds before that thing turns you into a fine mist," Vor's voice crackled over the comms. "Plenty of time," Kale replied, ducking behind a shattered column just as the walker cannons fired again. "I thrive under pressure." Back on the luminary veil, Althara watched the ground battle unfold on the tactical feed. Her forces were holding, but barely. The Coalition soldiers, humans, DSY, and her own Zonkin, fought with everything they had, their bravery tinged with desperation. And in the thick of it all was Kale. His movements were reckless but calculated, his strategy as unorthodox as it was effective. "He's either a genius or an idiot," muttered Varric, watching Kale's manoeuvres with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Perhaps both," Althara said, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. There was something infuriatingly familiar about his audacity, his way of turning even the most dire situation into a spectacle. The walker exploded in a brilliant cascade of fire and light, its legs buckling as Vor's heavy gunner took out its stabilizers and Sarah's precision shot pierced its power core. Kale stood amidst the wreckage, his armor scorched and his helmet visor cracked, but his triumphant grin was unmistakable. "Show off," Althara murmured, a strange mix of exasperation and admiration washing over her. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself a fleeting moment of hope. Perhaps the war was not just about survival, but also about reclaiming something she thought she had lost. The victory celebration was a symphony of sound and light, a stark contrast to the sombre echoes of war that had plagued the Zon Palace for years. The great hall of luminal spires was alive with mirth, an eclectic mix of music, laughter, and clinking glasses that spilled out into the corridors like a tidal wave of relief. The high-arching walls shimmered with holographic projections of Zon's history, the crystal fields of Corinth, the first voyages into the stars, and now their triumph over the Daxian threat. Princess Althara stood at the edge of the festivities, a chalice of spiced nectar in her hand, though she hadn't taken a sip. Her ceremonial armour, polished to a mirror-like gleam, felt heavier than usual, as though it bore the weight of more than just its crystalline plating. Her violet gaze roved over the assembled crowd, officers, diplomats, and soldiers mingling in a chaotic blur of exuberance. The atmosphere should have been infectious, but Althara's thoughts were elsewhere. She hadn't yet met the infamous Commander Karl Evan, the man whose brilliant manoeuvres had turned the tide of the war on the surface. Despite her reluctance, protocol demanded she personally acknowledge his efforts. After all, his tactics had saved countless lives, hers included. "Your Highness," said her aide, Callan, his tone laced with gentle urgency, "Commander Evan has arrived." Althara's fingers tightened slightly around the chalice. "Has he?" she replied, her voice betraying none of the unease coiling in her chest. "And where is our hero now?" Cullen gestured toward the far side of the hall, where a small crowd had gathered around a figure in scuffed armour. Karl Evan was unmistakable, his dishevelled dark hair and lopsided grin cutting a sharp contrast against the polished regalia of those around him. He was in the middle of a story, one that clearly involved grandiose gestures and questionable embellishments, judging by the laughter erupting from his audience. "And just as the walker's cannon lined up for the kill shot," Kale was saying, gesturing wildly, "I turned, winked at it and said, 'Not today, buddy.' Then bam, explosion, fireworks, the whole deal." I'm fairly certain walkers don't understand sarcasm, interjected Arandrix, the officer, her iridescent scales glinting in the light. They don't have to understand it, Cale shot back, his grin widening. They just have to fear it. Althara approached quietly, her presence unnoticed until she spoke. Commander Cale Evan, I presume. The group fell silent, parting like a tide to reveal Cale, who turned to face her with an expression that flickered between amusement and surprise. His grin softened into something more genuine as he inclined his head in a semblance of a bow. Your Highness, he said, straightening, I didn't expect to meet you so soon. I thought you'd have more pressing matters, like enjoying this nectar everyone keeps raving about. Althara arched a delicate brow. I prefer to save my appreciation for the people who ensure I'm still here to enjoy it. Fair enough, Cale said, his grin returning. In that case, you're welcome. The audacity of his response caught her off guard, and for a moment she wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or amused. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, and it disarmed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. You have quite the reputation, Commander, she said, recovering quickly, both on the battlefield and, it seems, at celebrations. Cale shrugged, his casual demeanour masking a flicker of weariness in his eyes. Reputations are like armour, useful, but they don't always fit right. I'd rather people judge me by my actions than my stories. Then let us speak of your actions, Althara said, her tone sharpening slightly. Your tactics on the surface were unconventional, to say the least. Cale's expression didn't falter. Unconventional wins battles, Your Highness. The Daxian weren't expecting us to hit them with everything from EMPs to makeshift sonic disruptors. They're big, bad, and terrifying, but they're not great at improvising. And are you always so cavalier with your methods? Only when it works, Cale replied, his grin shifting into something softer, almost boyish. Look, I know I don't exactly play by the rulebook, but rules don't tend to work against an enemy that rewrites the game. I did what I had to do, and I'd do it again if it meant saving lives. Althara studied him for a long moment, her gaze probing as if she was searching for something beyond his words. She found herself torn between irritation at his flippant attitude and admiration for his conviction. I see, she said finally, her voice losing some of its edge. Then I suppose I should thank you, Commander. Your actions have given us a chance at peace, a chance we might not have had otherwise. Cale inclined his head again, this time with a hint of genuine humility. Peace is worth fighting for, even if it means putting up with a room full of people who want to tell me how great I am. Althara allowed herself a faint smile, though she quickly suppressed it. Enjoy the celebration, Commander. I suspect you've earned it. As she turned to leave, Cale called after her. If you ever want to skip the formalities, Your Highness, I make a mean cup of Terran coffee. The audacity of the comment left her momentarily stunned. When she glanced back, he was already turning back to his laughing audience, the picture of someone who didn't take himself or anyone else too seriously. For the first time that night, Althara felt something other than the crushing weight of responsibility. She felt curious, intrigued by the man who seemed so out of place among the polished ranks of her court. Perhaps, she thought, the hero of the hour wasn't as straightforward as he seemed. The luminary veil hummed with life as it sailed through the shimmering expanse of the Vale Nebula, a bastion of Zon ingenuity among the stars. Its corridors, a labyrinth of sleek metal and glowing veins of energy, echoed with the steady cadence of boots and the occasional burst of laughter or chatter. The ship was a world unto itself, carrying the weight of a victorious fleet and the complexities of those who inhabited it. Cale Evan wandered these corridors with a sense of bemused curiosity, his Terran instinct still adjusting to the alien aesthetics of Zon design. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint rhythm, like the heartbeat of some immense sleeping creature, Every now and then, a faint shimmer of light would ripple through the hallways, as though the ship itself were alive and aware of his presence. "Is it just me?" he muttered to no one in particular. "Or does this place feel like it's judging me?" "Judging you for what?" came a voice from behind. Cale turned to find Carlin, the princess's ever-serious aide, standing with arms crossed and a faintly bemused expression on his otherwise stoic face. "For existing," Cale quipped, "these walls give off a vibe like they're whispering Terran interloper." Carlin's lips twitched, betraying the ghost of a smile. The ship's bioreactive architecture resonates with the neural patterns of Zon inhabitants. It is unlikely to be judging you, Commander. "Well, well, that's a relief," Cale said, rubbing the back of his neck, "because I'm pretty sure I already got enough judgment from the princess at the gala." "Her Highness is particular," Carlin said, his tone carefully neutral. "She values discipline and decorum, qualities you seem to wield selectively." "Selective's the best way to wield anything," Cale replied with a grin. "Too much of one thing, and you lose the element of surprise." Carlin gave him a look that hovered somewhere between skepticism and grudging respect. "Her Highness has requested your presence in the observation deck. She wishes to discuss the next phase of operations." Cale's grin faltered slightly. "Requested or demanded?" "Do you truly need to ask?" The observation deck of the Luminary Vale was a breathtaking expanse of glass and light, offering an unobstructed view of the nebula outside. The stars seemed impossibly close, their light refracted into a kaleidoscope of colours by the ship's energy field. Princess Althara stood at the centre, her silhouette framed by the celestial spectacle. She was clad in a more practical version of her ceremonial attire, her armour replaced with a sleek, fioazrenia, form-fitting uniform that emphasised her role as both leader and warrior. Cale entered with his usual swagger, though the grandeur of the room tempered his usual bravado. "You called, Your Highness?" Althara turned, her expression as inscrutable as ever. "Commander Evan, I trust you've acclimated to the ship." "Acclimating is a work in progress," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the pulsating walls. "Your ship and I are still figuring out how to get along." The faintest hint of amusement flickered across her face before it disappeared. "It seems you have a knack for forming unconventional alliances." "Part of my charm," he replied. She raised an eyebrow but chose not to comment. Instead, she gestured toward the holographic console at the centre of the room. With a wave of her hand, the stars outside were replaced by a detailed map of the galaxy, a mosaic of territories, trade routes, and conflict zones. "Our victory on Zon has bought us time," Althara said, her tone grave. "But the Daxian will regroup. Their fleet is scattered, but not broken. If we are to secure lasting peace, we must strike at the heart of their operations." Cale studied the map, his expression thoughtful. "And you're telling me this because your tactics on the surface proved effective," she said, her voice tinged with reluctant acknowledgement. "I need that same ingenuity if we are to succeed." "Ah," Cale said, his grin returning. "So, you're saying you need me?" "I'm saying your particular brand of chaos may have its uses," she replied coolly. "Do not mistake necessity for admiration, Commander." Cale chuckled. "Noted. So, what's the plan?" Althara gestured again, and the hologram zoomed in on a region of space dominated by a swirling maelstrom of energy. "This is the Neurus Expanse," she explained, "a region of unstable space near the Daxian core worlds. Intelligence suggests they've established a command hub within the expanse, using its natural hazards as a defensive barrier." "Natural hazards?" Cale echoed, his tone shifting to wary curiosity. "Gravitational anomalies, energy storms, and pockets of spatial distortion," Althara elaborated. "Navigating it is nearly impossible without precise calculations and advanced shielding." Nearly impossible? Cale repeated, sounding intrigued. Sounds like a challenge. It is, Althara said, and it's one we cannot afford to fail. A direct assault would be suicide, but if we can infiltrate their hub and disable their command systems, we may force them to retreat entirely. Cale frowned, his mind already racing through possibilities. Infiltration, huh? Small team, stealthy approach, lots of improvisation. Precisely, Althara said, which is why I'm assigning you to lead the mission. Cale blinked, caught off guard by her bluntness. Wait, me? Don't you have, I don't know, a whole squad of covert ops specialists for this sort of thing? They lack your creative problem-solving skills, she said, her tone making it clear she was choosing her words carefully. Cale rubbed his chin, a mixture of apprehension and excitement brewing in his chest. All right, he said finally, but on one condition. Althara tilted her head slightly, curiosity flickering in her eyes. And that is, you have to come with me. Her expression froze, a rare moment of genuine surprise breaking through her composed facade. You cannot be serious? Dead serious, Cale said, crossing his arms. If this mission is as dangerous as you say, we'll need every advantage we can get. And let's face it, you know the Daxians better than anyone. Plus, he grinned, I could use someone to keep me from getting lost in the spatial anomalies. For a long moment, Althara said nothing, her gaze locked with his. Finally, she sighed, the faintest hint of exasperation colouring her tone. Very well, Commander, but if this ends in disaster, I will personally ensure you answer for it. Deal, Cale said, extending a hand. She didn't take it, instead turning back to the hologram. Prepare yourself, Commander. The Expanse will not be forgiving. Cale watched her for a moment, his grin softening into something more thoughtful. Wouldn't dream of it, Your Highness. The luminary veil hung at the edge of the Nuss Expanse like a weary predator studying its prey. Before them lay a roiling tapestry of chaos, flashes of electric storms leaping across space like angry gods, black voids of gravitational anomalies pulling light into endless spirals, and shimmering pockets of spatial distortion where reality seemed to fold and ripple like liquid. Cale stood on the ship's bridge, his arms crossed and his expression somewhere between awe and dread. You know, I've seen some pretty terrifying things in my time, but this is like someone took a cosmic blender and hit puree. Althara, standing beside him, didn't take her eyes off the swirling expanse. The Expanse has claimed countless ships. Even with the Veil's advanced shielding, our margin for error is non-existent. Great pep talk, Your Highness, Cale said, his tone dry. Really putting my nerves at ease. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. If you're nervous, Commander, feel free to back out. I'm sure we can find someone else to lead this mission. Not a chance, Cale shot back, grinning. I'm just pointing out that this is the kind of job that calls for a pre-mission drink, or 3. Cullen, who was monitoring a console nearby, interjected, Perhaps instead of indulging in libations, you might focus on ensuring we survive the approach. Cale turned to him with mock indignation. Cullen, was that a joke? Did you just attempt sarcasm? I'm so proud of you. It was not sarcasm, Cullen replied, his tone as flat as ever. That's what makes it even better, Cale muttered, shaking his head. Althara cleared her throat, drawing their attention back to the task at hand. The infiltration team is assembled and ready, Commander. I trust you've reviewed the plan. Reviewed it, memorized it, and already thought of 3 ways it could go wrong, Cale said. Don't worry, I'm a big fan of contingency plans, and by fan, I mean I make them up as I go. That is both reassuring and deeply troubling, Althara said, turning to face him fully. This mission requires precision. Improvisation may get us through a skirmish, but it will not navigate the Expanse. Guess we find out, Cale replied, his grin never wavering. The infiltration team consisted of an eclectic mix of species and specialties, a testament to the coalition that had come together to oppose the Daxorans. There was Tannic, a towering Corran with bioluminescent markings and an unshakable calm. Arara, a Terran engineer whose quick wit rivaled her technical expertise, and Jix, a Zon scout whose keen eyes and sharper tongue often kept Kale on his toes. The team gathered in the Vale's deployment bay, checking gear and exchanging banter. Kale strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. "All right, team," he began, clapping his hands together. "We're about to dive headfirst into the galaxy's most unfriendly neighbourhood. If anyone forgot their survival gear or their sense of humour, now's the time to speak up." "Will sarcasm suffice in place of humour?" Jix asked, her tone deadpan. It encouraged Kale, who nodded sagely. "Sarcasm is a powerful survival tool. Just don't use it on the Daxarians. They don't appreciate it." Yara raised a hand, a mischievous grin on her face. "Do we have a contingency plan for when Kale inevitably gets us into trouble?" "Yes," Kale said without missing a beat. "The contingency plan is to trust me and hope for the best." "That's not a plan," Tannic rumbled, his deep voice carrying a hint of amusement. "It's worked so far," Kale countered, earning a mix of groans and laughter from the team. Althara entered the bay, her presence instantly sobering the mood. Clad in lightweight combat armour, she carried herself with the poise of a seasoned leader. The team fell silent, their banter replaced by palpable respect. "We have our mission," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "Our objective is to infiltrate the Daxian command hub, disable their systems, and extract critical data. This mission will not be easy, but it is necessary. Stick to your roles, trust each other, and we will prevail." Kale gave her an approving nod. "Well said, Your Highness, but you forgot one thing." She arched a brow. "And what is that?" "Try to have fun," Kale said, his grin returning. "We're making history here. Might as well enjoy it." Althara didn't dignify that with a response, though Jix snorted quietly and Arara muttered, "This is going to be interesting." The journey into the expanse was equal parts nerve-wracking and awe-inspiring. The team's shuttle, equipped with advanced shielding and cloaking technology, wove through the maelstrom with the grace of a dancer avoiding unseen blades. Kale piloted the craft, his hand steady on the controls despite the chaotic surroundings. "You know," he said, his voice light, "I always wanted to fly through a cosmic death trap. Really checks a box on the old bucket list." "Your humour is appreciated, Commander," Althara said from the co-pilot seat, her tone dry. "But perhaps you could focus on not getting us killed." "Multitasking is one of my many talents," Kale replied, dodging a sudden burst of energy that crackled across their path. The team watched in tense silence as the shuttle approached the outer edge of the Daxian command hub. The structure was a marvel of alien engineering, a massive, jagged fortress suspended within the chaos of the expanse. Its surface bristled with defensive emplacements and glowed faintly with the ominous red light of energy shields. "Looks cozy," Arara remarked. "Really gives off that invincible fortress vibe." "Invincible is just a word," Kale said. "Let's go make it meaningless." The shuttle slipped through a narrow opening in the fortress's defences, the team holding their breath as they entered the belly of the beast. The interior was as alien and intimidating as they'd expected, twisting corridors of dark organic material that pulsed faintly with an eerie red light. Kale took point, his blaster at the ready. "All right, team, let's make some history." "And let's try not to become history," Jix muttered, earning a quiet laugh from Arara. The group moved cautiously through. The fortress loomed, the tension palpable but tempered by their shared camaraderie. The mission had only just begun, but Kale couldn't help feeling that, despite the odds, they might just pull it off. After all, chaos was his specialty. The air inside the Daxian command hub was thick with an oppressive hum, a deep vibration that seemed to resonate in Cale's bones. The walls glowed faintly, their organic surfaces alive with pulsating veins of energy. The faint scent of ozone hung in the air, mixing with an acrid tang that made Cale wrinkle his nose. "Is it just me, or does this place smell like burnt despair?" he muttered, his voice low, but carrying just enough for the team to hear. "Probably the Daxian version of air freshener," Alara replied, glancing warily at a nearby wall. "Maybe it's meant to intimidate intruders." "Well, mission accomplished," Cale said. "I feel plenty intimidated." Tannic, ever the stoic, rumbled quietly, "Focus. The fortress may already be aware of us." Jix snorted softly, her sharp eyes scanning the corridor ahead. "If it isn't, it'll figure it out the moment Cale starts one of his famous improvised plans." Cale grinned, unbothered by the jab. "Improvisation is an art, Jix, and lucky for you, I'm a master artist." Althara, at the rear of the formation, silenced them with a sharp gesture. "Enough. We're approaching the first checkpoint. Keep your wits about you." The team pressed forward, their movements deliberate and silent. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadows. Strange, spindly machines moved along tracks embedded in the walls, their purpose unclear, but undoubtedly sinister. At the centre of the room, a cluster of Daxian guards stood around a console, their towering insectoid forms twitching with unsettling precision. Cale crouched behind a low barrier, studying the scene. "All right, folks, here's the plan. We distract them, disable the console, and hope they don't call for reinforcements." Alara raised an eyebrow. "That's not a plan, that's a wish." "Aren't all plans just wishes with better branding?" Cale quipped, earning a stifled laugh from Jix. Althara sighed softly. "We don't have time for debate, Commander." "Lead the distraction. The rest of us will handle the console." Cale gave her a mock salute. "Your wish is my command, Your Highness." Moments later, Cale stepped into the chamber with the confidence of someone who had no business being there. He held his blaster loosely at his side, his posture relaxed but alert. "Hey, fellas," he called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Quick question. Do you guys have a suggestion box? I have some thoughts about your interior design choices." The Daxian guards froze, their multifaceted eyes snapping toward him. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the hum of the machines. Then, as one, the guards began to advance, their movements unnervingly synchronized. "All right, not big on small talk." "Got it," Cale said, backing toward the far side of the room. "But seriously, this whole ominous alien hive aesthetic? A little cliché. Maybe throw in some houseplants, a water feature." The first guard lunged, and Cale ducked just in time, firing a quick shot that sent the creature stumbling. "Rude," he muttered, dodging another strike. Meanwhile, the rest of the team moved swiftly toward the console. Althara led the way, her movements graceful and precise, as she dispatched a straggling guard with her energy blade. Alara knelt by the console, her fingers flying over the alien controls. "Can you disable it?" Althara asked, her tone calm despite the chaos around them. "I can disable anything," Alara said, grinning. "Just give me 30 seconds and a little luck." "Luck is a finite resource," Tannic intoned, keeping watch as more guards began to pour into the chamber. "Well then, it's a good thing I'm efficient," Alara shot back. Cale's voice crackled over the comms. "No rush, but I'm running out of witty comebacks over here." "You're running out of comebacks?" Jix deadpanned, firing her rifle with unerring precision. "I thought that was impossible." "Believe it or not, I have my limits," Cale replied. Althara glanced toward the commotion, her jaw tightening. "Everin, fall back. You're outnumbered." "Outnumbered? Sure," Cale said, diving behind a pillar for cover. "Outgunned?" "Not yet." A blast of energy struck the pillar, sending shards of alien material flying. Kyle winced, muttering, "Okay, maybe a little outgunned." Arara let out a triumphant whoop as the console emitted a series of sharp beeps. "Got it! Systems are down. They won't be calling for reinforcements any time soon." "Good," Althara said. "We need to move before—" An ear-splitting roar shook the chamber, cutting her off. The team turned to see a massive Daxian enforcer enter the room, its towering frame bristling with biomechanical enhancements. "Ah, great," Kyle said, peeking out from his cover. "Because what's a party without the bouncer showing up?" The enforcer locked onto Kyle and charged, its thunderous steps shaking the floor. Kyle bolted, weaving through the room as the creature pursued him with single-minded determination. "Little help here," he shouted, narrowly avoiding a swipe of the enforcer's massive claws. Althara moved with practiced precision, her energy blade flashing as she engaged the enforcer. The rest of the team joined the fray, their combined efforts a whirlwind of coordinated attacks and quick thinking. Kale regrouped with them, panting slightly, but still grinning. "Nice teamwork, everyone. I think we're really starting to gel." Jix rolled her eyes. "Focus, Kyle." The enforcer let out another roar, its movements growing more erratic as the team's relentless assault began to take its toll. With a final coordinated strike, Althara drove her blade into the creature's core, and it collapsed with a deafening crash. The chamber fell silent save for the team's laboured breathing. "Well," Kyle said, surveying the wreckage, "that wasn't so bad." Althara gave him a flat look. "You have a very skewed definition of not so bad." "Comes with the job," Kale replied, clapping her on the shoulder. "Now let's keep moving. I'm sure there's plenty more trouble waiting for us." Althara nodded, her gaze sweeping the chamber. "Stay alert. This was just the beginning." Kale grinned, his usual irreverence undiminished. "Then let's make it memorable." The labyrinth of the Daxian fortress seemed to stretch infinitely, a tangled network of pulsating corridors and dimly glowing chambers. The further they ventured, the more the atmosphere thickened, as if the fortress itself was alive and aware of their intrusion. A low, persistent hum resonated through the walls, like the slow, steady heartbeat of a sleeping giant. Carl, leading the way, glanced over his shoulder at the team. "You know, I'm starting to think this place is less fortress and more digestive system." Isla grimaced, shooting a wary glance at the walls. "Thanks for that image, Kyle. Really helps the morale." "Just saying," Kyle replied with a grin. "If we see anything that looks remotely like teeth, I'm turning back." "Teeth would be preferable to what's ahead," Althara said, her tone sharp but not unkind. She held up a hand, signalling the team to halt. "We're approaching the central core. This is where the real defences will be." "Great," JS muttered, "because everything so far has been a cakewalk." Tannic, ever composed, adjusted the grip on his weapon. "Focus. The core is our objective. If we fail here, the battle above is lost." Kale's usual smirk softened into something resembling seriousness. "Don't worry, big guy. We won't fail." The central core was a cavernous space, its design both alien and strangely elegant. Towering columns of light rose from the floor to the ceiling, their shifting hues casting eerie patterns across the room. At the heart of the chamber stood a massive crystalline structure, pulsing with a rhythm that mirrored the fortress's hum. Energy conduits branched out from it like veins, carrying power to every corner of the structure. Kyle whistled softly. "Well, this is definitely where the magic happens." "Magic isn't the term I'd use," Alara said, her gaze fixed on the crystal. "That's a power nexus. If we disrupt it, we'll knock out the entire fortress's systems, but it'll probably try to kill us the moment we touch it." JS finished her tone dry. "Exactly." Kyle stepped forward, his blaster at the ready. "Well, no time like the present. Let's—" He was cut off by a sudden deafening screech. The wall seemed to shudder as a swarm of Daxian drones poured into the chamber, their sleek forms glinting in the shifting light. "Oh good," Cale said, backing toward the team. "I was starting to miss the welcome committee." "Positions," Althara commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. The team moved with practiced precision, forming a defensive perimeter around the crystal. Blaster fire and energy blasts filled the air as the drones attacked, their movements swift and coordinated. Cale ducked under a swooping drone, firing a quick shot that sent it spiraling into a nearby column. "You know," he called out, "for a species that hates outsiders, they sure roll out the red carpet." "Less talking, more shooting," Jay snapped, her rifle picking off another drone. Alara crouched by the crystal, her hands flying over the controls of a portable interface. "I need time to overload the Nexus. Keep them off me." "No pressure," Alara Cale said, grinning as he fired at another drone. "Take all the time you need. We'll just be here fighting for our lives." "Your sarcasm isn't helping," Alara muttered, though a faint smile tugged at her lips. As the battle raged on, the team began to feel the strain. The drones were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. Tannic, his massive frame a bulwark against the onslaught, took a hit to his shoulder, but remained steadfast. "I'm fine," he rumbled, brushing off the concern in Alara's eyes. "Focus on the mission." Cale, ducking behind cover, glanced at Alara. "How's that overload coming?" "Almost there," she called back. Her voice strained. "Just keep them busy a little longer." "Busy is my middle name," Cale said, popping up to take another shot. "Your middle name is probably Trouble," JS quipped, narrowly avoiding a drone's attack. "Funny," Cale replied. "I was thinking hero." "Focus," Althara snapped, her energy blade slicing through a drone with precise efficiency. The Nexus began to glow brighter, its pulse quickening as Alara's efforts took effect. The drones, as if sensing the threat, redoubled their assault. "We're running out of time," Althara shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Good news," Alara yelled. "The overload's set." "Bad news," she continued. "It's going to blow in 30 seconds." Cale's eyes widened. "That's a little less time than I'd like." "Move," Althara commanded, her voice steady despite the urgency. The team sprinted toward the exit, dodging drones and stray energy blasts as the Nexus's glow intensified. The hum of the fortress rose to a deafening pitch, the walls trembling as if in protest. As they reached the corridor, a massive explosion rocked the fortress, sending a shockwave that knocked them off their feet. Cale groaned, pushing himself up and glancing back at the chamber. The Nexus was gone, replaced by a seething mass of energy that was rapidly consuming the room. "Well," he said, brushing dust off his jacket, "I'd call that a job well done." "Done, but not over," Alara said, helping Tannic to his feet. "The fortress is collapsing. We need to reach the shuttle before we're caught in the implosion." "Always with the dramatic exits," Kyle muttered, though his grin never wavered. The team raced through the corridors, the walls cracking and buckling around them. Chunks of debris fell from the ceiling, forcing them to dodge and weave as the fortress crumbled. "Next time," JS panted, "can we pick a mission that doesn't involve imminent death?" "Where's the fun in that?" Cale replied, leaping over a fallen beam. They reached the shuttle bay just as the fortress began to collapse in earnest. Cale dove into the pilot seat, his hands flying over the controls. "Hang on, everyone. This is going to be a bumpy ride." The shuttle roared to life, blasting out of the bay and into the chaotic expanse behind them. The fortress imploded in a blinding burst of light, sending shockwaves that rippled through the void. As the team caught their breath, Althara turned to Cale. "That was reckless." "Maybe," Cale said, his grin returning, "but it worked." Jix rolled her eyes, but there was a faint smile on her lips. Alara leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. "Remind me to never let you plan anything again." Kyle chuckled. "You say that now, But admit it, you love the excitement." "Excitement?" Yara muttered. "Sure, Letun, call it that." The team fell into a weary but victorious silence, the distant stars stretching out before them as they left the ruins of the fortress behind. The aftermath of the mission was a haze of subdued chaos, the kind that left a team simultaneously exhilarated and exhausted. The shuttle hummed quietly, its engines a stark contrast to the explosions they'd just escaped. The stars stretched endlessly ahead, an open road of glittering possibilities. For the first time in hours, the crew wasn't dodging death. Kyle leaned back in the pilot's seat, stretching dramatically. "Well, team, another successful day saving the galaxy. I say we celebrate with some well-earned drinks, maybe a little music too, something upbeat to mark our survival." "You're assuming we've survived completely," Yara pointed out, her voice tinged with mock severity. "We've still got to make it back to the fleet, and I wouldn't put it past the Daxians to try something desperate." "Always the optimist," Kale said with a grin. "You'd be surprised how much optimism it takes to keep patching you up," Yara retorted, smirking from the co-pilot's chair. Alara watched the banter with an expression that was harder to read. She had been quieter since the fortress, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Kyle noticed but didn't comment immediately. And the return to the fleet wasn't as dramatic as the mission itself, though they encountered some debris fields that required evasive maneuvers, something Kale turned into a theatrical display of piloting prowess. "Seriously," he announced, spinning the controls with exaggerated flair. "You're all lucky to have me. Most pilots would have cracked under the pressure of this artful obstacle course." "Most pilots would have avoided the debris in the first place," Jix deadpanned, not looking up from her weapon maintenance. "Where's the fun in that?" Kale replied, laughing. Althara, however, remained silent, her focus still on the horizon of stars. When they finally docked with the flagship Solara, a warm reception awaited them. Cheers erupted in the hangar bay as the team descended the ramp, though Kyle, ever the showman, couldn't resist pretending it was all for him. "Too kind," he called, spreading his arms wide. "Really, I'm just a humble hero doing my part." Althara stepped forward, her regal bearing commanding silence almost instantly. The officers and soldiers in the hangar bowed slightly, their deference a reminder of her dual role as both warrior and royalty. "Your bravery is noted," she said, her voice carrying easily over the crowd. "But there is still much to do. Begin preparations to solidify our victory. We've won this battle, but the war is far from over." Her words carried weight, and the crowd dispersed quickly, moving with purpose. Kyle watched her closely, noting the subtle tension in her posture. Later, in the quiet of the observation deck, Kale found Althara standing alone, her gaze fixed on the planet below. Its surface, scarred from years of conflict, gleamed faintly under the light of a nearby star. "Penny for your thoughts?" Kale asked, leaning casually against the wall. Althara didn't look at him immediately. "It's strange," she said finally. "Victory should feel lighter, but all I can think about is the cost, the lives lost, the people I couldn't save." Kale stepped closer, his usual bravado tempered. "That's because you care, and that's what makes you a good leader." She turned to him then, her expression softening. "Do you ever stop deflecting with jokes?" Kale smiled, but there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Not often," he said. "Humour is a lot easier to handle than, reality." For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the faint hum of the ship. "You've changed," Althara said quietly. Kale raised an eyebrow. "Me? Nah, still the same charming rogue I've always been." "No," she said firmly. "You're more than that now. I see it in the way you lead, the way you care about the team, even when you pretend not to. You've grown." Kale looked away, uncharacteristically flustered. "Well, I had a good example," he said, his voice softer than usual. Althara smiled faintly, and for the first time since the mission, She seemed at peace. The celebration that followed was subdued but meaningful. The crew gathered in the mess hall, swapping stories and raising glasses to their fallen comrades. Jix managed to outdrink everyone while maintaining her usual deadpan wit, much to Cale's mock indignation. "You're a machine," he declared, shaking his head. "No, I'm just better than you," Jix replied without missing a beat. Alara, for her part, regaled the group with exaggerated tales of Cale's antics during the mission, much to his dismay. "That's not how it happened," he protested. "It's close enough," Alara said with a grin. Even Tannic joined in, his rare smile earning a round of cheers. Althara watched it all from a distance, her heart lighter than it had been in days. She raised her glass in a silent toast, her gaze lingering on Cale. In the days that followed, life aboard the Solara settled into a new rhythm. Repairs were made, strategies revised, and hope rekindled. Cale, to his surprise, found himself looking forward to the next mission, not for the thrill, but for the chance to make a difference. As for Althara, she stood taller than ever, her confidence unshaken. The burden of leadership was heavy, but she carried it with grace, knowing she wasn't alone. And in the quiet moments, when the stars stretched endlessly before them, she would think back to the boy she'd once known, the one who'd become a soldier, a leader, and perhaps something more. The galaxy was vast and uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Althara felt a spark of something she hadn't dared hope for. Peace.